On sifting the facts and pay attention to those facts that are relevant for our judgment and for our action. Another useful lesson I learned was working hard for prolonged periods, both on subjects I liked and those I thought were dull. You have to sort of press yourself through something, and that's hard work, and it requires discipline, and it's very hard to do away with that. You cannot play your way through life or through professions, unless you're very lucky. I was not. I had to work hard, and I learned. And my sons too, I found, have also learned to work very hard, periodically. Not year in and year out, then I wear it down, but periodically. But of course, we also had fun as undergraduates at the university. You need to orient yourself in the world. And in the 1940s, we took in the new literature, Kafka, Sartre, Camus, Hemingway. An appetite for literature can lead you to new joys and insight all your life. If you acquire the habit of reading good literature, yes, it's interesting for you to see new books and to take them in. We engaged in political clubs and debates, and for many, like Olof Palme, the Swedish Prime Minister who was murdered, you know, was very well known. To him, the student period was very useful education. He learned to debate and to argue in politics. I spent more time in the student theater than I did in the political clubs, where I were in both. And those experiences on and at the stage were more formative than perhaps I realized at the time. A cast in a play must work as a team. Few things are as much teamwork as when you perform a play. A soccer team, I think, is nothing to compare to the teamwork that you need on the stage. When you act as a part, you depend upon other parts to give you the cue, and the right cue. Otherwise, you don't know when do I come in and say this particular line. So it's teamwork all the way. And that is useful in life. Most of us would have to work in teams, and most of us would have to get on and rely on our fellows. Moreover, in theater, you have to learn to speak clearly and sufficiently loud to enable the audiences to hear. The same is true for all public speaking. I've been to many conferences and sessions and assemblies where someone stands up there in the middle and mumbles and no one hears. And if you really want to hear, you switch on the interpreter, because the interpreters are usually better. A lesson I learned at a club meeting that I was asked to chair. There were different views and a need for a joint conclusion on action. I learned on that occasion, I never really thought of it before, to listen very carefully to what all of them had to say, and then to try to sift out and identify the common denominators in the discussion. To find, was there something in common, and then lift it up, but also to make clear to the others that yes, I had heard them, I'd heard the arguments, because a chairman is a trustee of a meeting in most cases. Sometimes he may be opposed to there and they have all the power, but in many cases the chairman should be a trustee of all of those who are here, and you all are entitled to be heard by the chairman, to listen to him. And then when he sums up, he tries to find what is the common, the dominant feeling here, and then also explain why he doesn't take this or that point. So I learned that as a chairman of it was the meeting of the Nordic Student Theatres, actually, in Uppsala, perhaps in 1948. In my studies, I took a strong interest in the subject of international law. How could respect for laws replace the respect for arms in international society? The period of 1946 to 1950, when I studied law in Uppsala, was right after the World War. And naturally, we then took a strong interest in the UN and followed the work of the new organization. My urge to see the world remained, but I abandoned my plans for a career in diplomacy. When one of my father's friends asked me if I really wanted to become one of those fellows who would lunch and go cocktail party all their lives, I began to think that regular diplomatic work was too unfocused for my interest in world organization. Perhaps I was unfair. Diplomacy is still a crucially important profession that calls for many skills. You need to be able to establish contacts easily, to absorb languages and use them, to have sharp eyes and good ears, and to report accurately to home. Not what you think they may want to hear, but what is the truth as you see it. You must be able to speak precisely. Evil tongues said that diplomats are people who think twice before saying nothing. Well, that's better than not thinking at all and saying something stupid. Avoiding harm may be the first rule. Most diplomatic jobs are fairly well paid, but there are also drawbacks in the diplomatic profession. It's often hard for both spouses to get jobs in the same place, especially a small country like Sweden that have small embassies and small consulates. Moving around the world with children who don't become rooted and to have to attend many different schools may be difficult. My wife and I had lived separately for about 10 years of our lives. She lived in Geneva, where I could get a job, and I lived in Vienna. Then she lived in Brussels, and I continued to live in Vienna. Well, that's not ideal, but at a time when both spouses want to have a job, it's not so easy to arrange it if you are in a profession like diplomacy. There are many other professions like that, businesses abroad, etc. Good luck had it that in the last year of my studies for the LLB at Uppsala in 1915, I won a prize in the UN International Essay Contest with an essay about the rule of unanimity in the Security Council, the veto rule. The prize was 1 month at the UN in New York in the autumn of 1950. Not bad. Free travel and 1 month in New York. That month in New York convinced me that I should take up graduate studies in international law and to do so outside Sweden, because there was not so much of a science here. I took a loan in the bank, and my father lent me some money, and Trinity Hall in Cambridge accepted me as a research student. And after 2 years at Cambridge, I spent 2 years at Columbia University on a scholarship in New York, and obtained then thereafter doctorates both in Cambridge and in Stockholm, where I submitted another thesis. Universities are not the only places where you can soak up knowledge and wisdom, but they can be wonderful places for learning and for developing critical and constructive thinking, especially critical thinking. Without critical thinking, we can be taken on many rides. Without critical thinking in 2002 and 2003, the US and the UK governments looked uncritically at evidence and concluded that Iraq still had weapons of mass destruction. They were wrong. My Iraq inspection teams at the UN looked with critical eyes on the material and avoided making the mistake that these two governments made, which led to a terrible war and still terrible consequences. The only, perhaps, gain was the disappearance of a very brutal dictator. In 1956, I had attended 3 universities, Uppsala, Cambridge, then Columbia, and here now to Stockholm. And I've been able to learn from 2 of the world's greatest professors in international law. My aim in life was then to become a professor in Sweden. It looked rather hopeful, actually. I still see the academic world as an attractive profession. There is a greater bureaucratic burden nowadays than there used to be, but there is still much personal freedom for research, and you feel you can work at the frontier of knowledge in any given field where you are researching. You can choose what you want to do research on, and you feel you are at the frontier. It's exciting. I became an associate professor at the Stockholm University, and I liked both teaching and research. But I also needed action. And through the International Affairs Committee of the Young Liberal Movement, I took part in meetings with European students, liberal students, and we debated and we drafted resolutions about the European unification, il faut faire l'Europe, we said, and the emancipation of the developing countries. It was exciting, and it was also a good training for international parliamentary life. After a couple of years of university life and youth politics, I was asked in 1961, at the age of 33, to be the foreign minister's representative in the 6th committee, legal committee of the UN General Assembly. Came as a surprise. I sat in my small apartment in Stockholm, and the phone rang, and someone said, "Is foreign minister Undén?" I said, "Could you come and see me?" I said, "Yes, indeed." So I came, and the offer was given. I remained a delegate to the UN General Assembly every autumn for 20 years. From 1981 until 1997, Then I came each year to the Assembly as the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency to report on the past year's work of the IAEA. In 1997, I retired just 1 year before I turned 70, and from 2000 to 2003, I was in charge of the UN inspectors for Iraq. So you can see I have seen a lot of the UN system in my life, and what I'm working on now, I work on a book on the restraints on the use of armed force and on the UN system. Now let me return to the 1960s. I was taken to the Swedish ministry as a full-time advisor on the international law in 1963, and in that capacity I worked as an attorney, you might say, for the ministry, picking up all kinds of legal problems they had and giving them advice. And also as a representative at many conferences in the world, because there are many conferences on international law. The law of treaties was the area in which I had written my thesis, and it was also my first international conference. It was as important to codify the law of treaties for nations as it was to codify the law of contract in individual states. That's a fundamental law in all states. Law of treaties was fundamental as well. But I also took part in conference on the laws of war. After the Vietnam War, we modernized many of the rules. Some of them are ineffective, but they also saved many lives. And of course, I took part in much work on disarmament in Geneva together with Alva Myrdal, whose legal advisor I was. One experience was that you must always know your dossier, know the material.